Every murderer tells a story. To the police. To themselves. To 12 strangers in a jury box. The smart ones keep it simple. A robbery. A sudden rage. A shadowy stranger. Something believable. Something that explains the blood, the body, the why. But in Ocala, Florida, in the quiet, sprawling hours before dawn on a Friday in March, a killer attempted something far more ambitious. He didn't just try to hide a crime. He tried to write one. From scratch. He constructed a setting, populated it with characters, and penned a perfect, tragic ending for his husband, Tim Smith. He handed the manuscript to detectives, fully expecting them to read it and agree. It was a story of secret desires and a kinky rendezvous gone horrifically wrong. And on the surface, it made a terrible kind of sense. But this author made a fatal mistake. He was so focused on the broad strokes of his plot, the scandalous premise, the shocking violence, that he forgot to mind the details. The punctuation, the stage directions, the tiny, telling sentences that a careful reader would circle in red pen. Because the truth is, you can't stage reality. A story that tries too hard will always betray itself. A perfectly made bed in a room where no one slept. The chemical scent of bleach where there should only be the smell of life. A narrative that explains everything, except for the things it desperately can't. This is the story of that story, and of how the smallest, strangest clues, a missing towel, a misplaced bottle, a hatred of bleach, became the proof that convicted an author of his own wife's murder. Just before 11 on a Saturday morning, a deputy from the Marion County Sheriff's Office knocked on the door of an apartment at Citrus Park. It was a welfare check. 2 calls had come in about a 59-year-old man named Timothy Smith. He hadn't shown up for work. His friends were worried. His husband was waiting outside, looking for help. The deputy used a key from the landlord. The door swung open into a living room, spare and neat. The air inside carried a sharp, clean scent, like a hospital or a freshly scrubbed floor. The place was quiet. Too quiet. A television in one bedroom was on, glowing silently. It was in the second bedroom that the story the killer had written began its first, grim chapter. Tim Smith was on the floor, on his back, at the foot of the bed. He was wearing a t-shirt and a pair of sneakers. Nothing else. Around his neck was a dark, brutal ligature mark. He was clearly gone. This was the inciting incident. The hook. A man found dead in his playroom, a secret apartment he and his husband maintained away from their main home. The stage was set for a specific kind of tragedy. Outside, Tim's husband, Herbert, Herb to everyone, waited. He was a handyman, a practical man used to solving problems with his hands. He was upset, but there was a strange, procedural calm to his distress. He began explaining things to the deputy, to anyone who would listen, filling the silent horror with words. He and Tim didn't actually live here, he said. This was Tim's secondary apartment, his massage studio, their party place. They used it for private hookups, meetings arranged on apps. They had a 20-year-old daughter at their real home, you see. They needed discretion. Massage was even their code word for it. Herb painted a picture of a life of agreed-upon secrets. He offered this context freely, readily. It was the backstory for the scene inside. Of course this could happen. They lived on the edge of risk. This was the world they'd built. And when the detective asked him to walk through the apartment later, to point out anything strange, Herb became the editor of his own grim tale. The smell, for one. That bleach. Tim hated bleach, Herb said. He would never use it. Then, the details of the set dressing. 2 towels were missing from the bathroom. Others were gone from a drawer. A bottle of lubricant was in the wrong room. It belonged by the massage table, not here by the bed. And those leather garments? Tim was fastidious about his leather. He would always hang it up, never leave it folded on a shelf or draped on a chair. Herb was reading the crime scene like a script and pointing out the continuity errors. He was noting the props that were out of place. He was, in effect, telling the detectives, this scene isn't right. Someone has tampered with it. And he was absolutely correct. But the question no one asked him in that moment was the most important one. If you weren't here, Herb, how do you know so precisely how everything should have been? To understand the story Herb was trying to tell, You have to understand the life he and Tim shared. On paper, it was a comfortable life. They'd been together 15 years, married for 8. Tim was the successful one, the executive director of a senior living center. He was the breadwinner, the planner, the one who embraced self-improvement and charity work after they both got sober. Herb ran a handyman business, a less stable income, but together they afforded a nice home, toys, and that secret second apartment. But this comfortable life was built on a foundation of performance. Their entire relationship had a shared, secret script. The massage code, the hidden playroom, the careful shielding of their activities from their daughter, Jordan. They were co-authors of a double life. In the months before his death, however, the script was being rewritten. Tim was being recruited for a new job in another city, a fresh start that likely meant leaving the marriage and Herb behind. The financial dependency Herb had on Tim was about to hit a cliff. The comfortable narrative was fraying, and Herb's lines in those final months, delivered to friends, took on a dark, angry tone. He ranted about Tim. He screamed that Tim was a lazy SOB, that he owed him, that he had supported Tim early on and was owed a debt. The calm, handy co-author was now a spurned character, threatening to get back at him. The motive was crystallizing, a desperate man, facing the end of his financial and marital security. But a motive is just a theme. It's not a plot. For Herb to benefit, for the new story to work, Tim couldn't just leave. He had to die, and it couldn't look like Herb had anything to do with it. So, Herb the handyman, the builder, the problem solver, began drafting a new finale. He wouldn't just commit a murder. He would construct a narrative. He would use their own secret life, the playroom, the hookups, the risks, as the perfect cover. He would make Tim the victim of his own clandestine lifestyle. A stranger from the apps. A kinky encounter that spiraled into violence. It was tragic, sordid, and most importantly, it pointed away from the husband waiting worriedly at home. It was, in theory, the perfect plot. But as the detectives left the sterile, staged apartment and began looking past the story they'd been handed, the pages of this manuscript started to crumble. The details Herb had so helpfully corrected weren't just mistakes left by a careless stranger. They were the author's own fingerprints, smudged all over the page. The official story was clear: a risky hookup, a violent stranger, a tragedy born from a secret life. But the evidence, line by line, sentence by sentence, began to tell a different story. A story with a glaring plot hole right in its very first paragraph. The medical examiner's report was the first brutal rewrite. Tim Smith hadn't just been strangled. His neck was broken. The violence was extreme, savage. But there was another fact, buried in the toxicology report, that made no sense in the heat-of-the-moment script. Tim's bloodstream contained a massive overdose of diphenhydramine, the active ingredient in Benadryl. We're not talking a couple of allergy pills. We're talking a concentration over 30 times a normal dose. Enough to induce a coma. Enough to ensure a person would be profoundly, utterly unconscious. So which was it? A violent, struggling confrontation with a stranger? Or a drugged, helpless man being attacked in his sleep? The two facts clashed on the page. You don't need to break the neck of a man already subdued by a chemical tsunami. The over-the-top violence felt like an exaggeration, a flourish, as if the author, wanting to scream "stranger danger," had written the violence in all caps, not realizing that in doing so, he'd contradicted his own premise. Then came the supporting characters. Every good story needs them, and in Herb's manuscript, they were implied. The shady, criminal connections from the shadowy world of secret hookups. Detectives found their first candidate. A latent fingerprint on that misplaced bottle of lubricant, the one Herb had pointed out as being in the wrong room. It matched a man named James Taylor, with a history of drugs and burglary. A perfect suspect. Almost too perfect. When they reached him, James was confused. He had no connection to Tim Smith. His phone records placed him solidly in Fort Lauderdale, hours away, on the night in question. He was a red herring, but one whose fingerprint had somehow swam into this particular bottle in this particular apartment. Then DNA. From the same bottle cap, a match to another man, Lloyd Kelly. Another name with a record. Another potential violent stranger to cast in the role. But Lloyd had an even more ironclad alibi. He was in jail in another state at the time of the murder. Two men with criminal pasts, their biological signatures placed on a key piece of evidence, yet both physically incapable of committing the crime. It was as if the killer had collected these criminal fingerprints and DNA like props and carefully smeared them on the bottle to point the narrative in a specific, believable direction. But he'd forgotten to check their alibis. He'd written them into the story without doing the character work. And the bottle itself? It was a glaring error in continuity. Herb, the meticulous editor of the scene, had been the one to tell police it was in the wrong place. It was a clue that screamed staging. But by placing the fingerprints of uninvolvable men on it, the staging had a second layer. It was a clue designed to be found, to lead to a dead end. A double bluff. The narrative was getting messy. But the author's greatest challenge wasn't just planting clues. It was playing his own part convincingly. In the days after Tim's body was found, Herb held meetings with his closest friends. These weren't just grief sessions. They were live rehearsals. And his friends, his audience, started to notice the actor was off script. His best friend, Kevin, found Herb's calmness unnatural. Where was the panic? The devastation? Instead, Herb was focused, offering detailed, unsolicited explanations for things Kevin hadn't even asked about. He talked about how the key to the apartment was missing. Tim must have taken it. He elaborated on how their Ring doorbell camera at the main house had mysteriously glitched and stopped working that very night. He was volunteering backstory, building his own alibi with words, trying to patch potential holes in the plot before anyone else could see them. Another friend, Candy, visited the main house to offer support. What she saw wasn't a home in mourning. It was an active editing suite. Family portraits were off the walls. Tim's favorite decor, seashells, mermaids, a beach-themed aesthetic he loved, was in the trash. Herb was throwing away his husband's life, piece by piece. And then Candy noticed the bigger deletions. A large area rug from the living room was gone. A coffee table had vanished. Another rug was missing. Herb explained it away casually. The dog had peed on them. He'd thrown them out early Friday morning. Just hours after Tim was last seen alive. This was no longer just acting. This was set dressing on a grand scale. Something had happened in that house that required not just cleaning, but the physical removal of entire pieces of furniture. Herb wasn't just grieving. He was conducting a thorough, methodical strike of any evidence that the opening scene of this tragedy might have happened here, and not in the stage department. The story was supposed to be a contained thriller in the playroom, but the author was frantically revising chapters in the main house, tearing out pages and burning them. The pressure was showing. The calm, explanatory demeanor he showed police was cracking under the scrutiny of those who knew him. He was over-explaining. He was disposing of props with a haste that looked less like cleanliness and more like panic. He was, as any writer might, becoming tangled in the threads of his own complicated plot. And then, the detectives found the security footage. The unedited, time-stamped, impartial record that no narrator could explain away. This footage didn't just contradict Herb's story. It provided a chilling, silent director's commentary of the entire night's production. The security footage did not show a face. It did not show a murder. It showed something more profound, the architecture of a lie. It revealed the movement of machines in the dead of night, and in their silent, time-stamped journeys, told a truth that all of Herb's words could not erase. Let's reconstruct the timeline, not from testimony, but from the unblinking digital eyes scattered between the main house on Buffington and the apartment at Citrus Park, a distance of only 2.5 miles. The official story, Herb's story, implied that Tim left on his own, that he drove his Jeep to his playroom for a fateful meeting, that he was the sole author of his final movements. The cameras told a different story. At 1:59 a.m., a white pickup truck, a vehicle matching Herb's, pulling a distinctive black trailer, was captured leaving the vicinity of the main house. It traveled north. Minutes later, it passed a business called Triple Crown Trailers, which sat around the corner from Tim's apartment. The truck and trailer were on the move, in the middle of the night. Then, It looped back. The same white truck and trailer were seen returning to the main house, completing a round trip. This was trip 1. Silence for a while. Then, the main character's vehicle enters the scene. At 2:43 a.m., Tim Smith's Jeep is seen on camera. It passes Triple Crown trailers. It passes a gas station. It pulls into the parking spot at Citrus Park, where it would remain untouched for 2 days. The staging was complete. The set was dressed. The victim's car was in place. The final, convincing detail to sell the narrative. Tim came here on his own. But the cameras had already seen the first act. And technology provided the clincher. The digital ghost of Tim Smith himself. His cell phone, always carried in his little black bag, did not travel with the Jeep at 2:43 a.m. Its location data showed it had already made the journey to the apartment. It had traveled earlier, on trip 1, in the white truck. The implication was cold and clear. Tim Smith was already at the apartment, or worse, in that trailer, on the first trip. His Jeep's later, solitary journey was a pantomime. A remote-controlled prop moved into position to sell a story. But this created a new problem for our author. If the truck delivered Tim and the Jeep was now here, how does the truck driver get home? The cameras had the answer. After the Jeep was parked, the footage shows a lone figure, a shadow, moving on foot along the same route back toward the main house. A 2-mile walk in the dark. The author, leaving the set, disappearing into the night. And what awaited him at home? The final piece of digital sabotage. Within minutes of when that walking figure would have arrived home, the Ring doorbell system at the main house, the one Herb had claimed mysteriously glitched, was accessed. Not by a malfunction, by the app on a cell phone. And in that access, several video files from the critical early morning hours were permanently deleted. Herb had told his friend Kevin about the glitch, a preemptive explanation. But the digital log was a confession. He hadn't lost the footage. He had erased it. He was deleting the raw, unedited scenes that contradicted his final cut. This was no longer a case of building a story. This was a case of a story collapsing under the weight of its own infrastructure. The plot holes weren't minor. They were cavernous. Why make a 2-mile round trip with a trailer in the middle of the night if your husband simply drove himself to an affair? Why would a man being drugged into a stupor engage in a violent struggle that broke his own neck? Why would a stranger, in a frenzy, stop to meticulously place a bottle of lubricant in the wrong room, and then carefully clean the entire apartment with a chemical the victim despised? And why, if you were an innocent, grieving husband, would your first instinct be to digitally disassemble the security system of your own home? Each question was a sentence in the true story, the one being written not by Herb, but by the silent testimony of time stamps, data packets, and a forgotten bottle of gun oil. The manuscript was falling apart, and soon, it would be time for someone else to read it aloud in a place where there are no edits, no deletions, and no walkaways in the dark, a courtroom. The trial of Herbert Swilly was not merely a presentation of evidence. It was a literary critique. The prosecution and the defense would each be handed the same messy manuscript, the crime scene, the forensics, the footage, and asked to tell the jury what it really meant. The prosecution's argument was clean, narrative-driven. They presented Herb as an author whose ambition exceeded his skill, a man financially dependent on a husband who was planning to leave, a man who saw not a divorce, but an ending. And so he wrote one. He drugged Tim with a lethal cocktail of Benadryl in their home. He staged the violent strangulation. He used his trailer, the tool of his trade, to transport the body to the staged set. He parked the Jeep. He walked home. He deleted the footage. He planted the red herrings. He over-explained. He disposed. He performed. They had the motive. They had the means. They had the timeline. And they had the damning, character-driven testimony from those who knew him best. Candy Baker took the stand and described the callous disposal of Tim's life. The photos in the trash, the rugs gone, the cold pronouncement that it was his house now. The portrait was of a man not in grief, but in possession. But the most devastating testimony came from the person who lived in the house where the first draft of this horror was likely written, Jordan, Herb's daughter. She spoke of the noises in the night. Sounds hard to describe. She spoke of the Ring doorbell alerts pinging her phone, alerts that vanished by morning. And she spoke of the directive from her father, the author, trying to control her part in the story. When she mentioned the noises, he told her what to say. You didn't hear anything. You were sleeping. That's all you need to remember. He asked her to lie, to say he'd been home all night, to become a character in his fiction. The defense, faced with this mounting edit of suspicion, had only one strategy left: to propose an alternative ending. They attacked the manuscript itself, pointing to the very flaws as proof of other authors. They highlighted the fingerprints and DNA of James Taylor and Lloyd Kelly. See, they argued. Dangerous men. Strangers. Their marks are on the bottle. The prosecution's neat story ignores these characters. They even pointed a finger, with a shocking lack of evidence, at Jordan herself. She was the secondary beneficiary on the life insurance, they noted. If Herb was ruled out, she would get the money. Could she be lying? Could she have been involved? It was a desperate, scattershot attempt to scribble over the narrative, to introduce chaos, shadowy figures, and doubt where the prosecution had built a clear, causal chain. But in their closing argument, the prosecutors addressed this head-on, appealing not just to logic, but to the jury's innate understanding of story. But if James Taylor didn't do it, they said, then it was Lloyd Kelly. And if it wasn't Lloyd Kelly, then it was Jordan. All of those things can't be true. They dismantled the defense's fanfiction. If Jordan was lying for money, wouldn't she invent a better lie? Wouldn't she say she saw her dad dragging a body? Her testimony was quiet, specific, and rang with the pain of betrayal. It wasn't the dialogue of a conspirator. It was the voice of a witness lost in a tragedy she didn't write. The jury was left with two versions. One, a complex but coherent tale of a man who staged a murder to look like the consequence of a secret life. Two, a series of chaotic, contradictory possibilities involving improbable strangers or a daughter with no motive, requiring a belief in a cascade of random, unlucky events that all pointed, by pure coincidence, directly at Herbert Swilly. They deliberated. They read the manuscript for themselves. And they reached a verdict on the authorship. Guilty. The word is a period. A full stop. The end of the story. After a week of testimony, the jury found the narrative of a staged hookup gone wrong to be a fabrication. They believed the evidence, the silent testimony of the security cameras, the screaming contradiction of the forensic report, the tragic edits to the home, the deleted digital scenes. They believed Herbert Swilly was the author of his wife's death. In September of 2025, at the age of 57, Herb was sentenced to the only ending Florida law allows for first-degree murder: life in prison without the possibility of parole. There is no appeal to the editor. No chance for a rewrite. The manuscript is closed, filed away in the permanent record. But what of the other character in this story? The one who was not the author, but the subject? The man whose life was reduced to a plot point in a desperate, clumsy novel? Timothy Smith is still remembered, not as a cautionary tale about secret lives, but as a father figure to Jordan, a beloved brother to Sandy, a dedicated friend, a pillar in his recovery community, a man who loved the beach and filled his home with its shells and mermaids. His story, his real story, was one of self-improvement, of service, of complex love. It was a story interrupted, erased by someone who thought he could write a better one. And that is the ultimate failure of Herbert Swilly's plot. In his frantic attempt to control the narrative, to spin a story of random, sordid violence, he overlooked the fundamental truth about the people in our lives. They are not characters to be manipulated. Their lives are not subplots to serve our own. They are entire, breathing novels unto themselves. When Herb decided to end Tim's story, he believed he could contain the fallout within the pages of a lie. He failed to see that Tim's story was woven into a vast library of other lives, friends, family, a community, who would never accept the fake version. They became the proofreaders. They spotted the lies in the dialogue, the errors in the timeline, the hollow performance of grief. The details betrayed him because true details, the kind that convict, are not just physical. They are emotional. They are the memory of a hatred of bleach. The knowledge of how a man hangs his leather. The instinctive chill when a grieving husband is too calm, too explanatory, too busy throwing the set dressing away. This case was not solved by a single, shining clue. It was solved by the cumulative weight of 1,000 tiny wrongnesses. A story that didn't feel right. It was solved because humans are, at our core, innate storytellers. We sense when a narrative rings true, and we itch when it doesn't. The detectives, the friends, the daughter, the jury, they all felt that itch. And they kept scratching until the false skin of the lie peeled away, revealing the ugly, premeditated truth beneath. So, what do we take from this tragedy, beyond the true crime details? We remember that every day, we are all both authors and readers. We write our own stories through our choices. And we read the stories of those around us, looking for consistency, for truth, for the genuine connection between action and character. When someone's story suddenly changes, when the dialogue becomes forced, when the explanations pile up unsolicited, when the familiar set pieces of their life are hastily dismantled, pay attention. You may be witnessing the first draft of a lie. Herb Swilly's mistake was believing that a story, once written, was powerful enough to overwrite reality. But reality has a stubborn grammar all its own. It follows rules, cause and effect, time and space, the physics of a moving trailer, the chemistry of a drugged body, the digital fingerprints on a deleted file. You can break a man's neck, but you cannot break the rules of the world you're trying to deceive. In the end, the handyman, the builder, the fixer, was undone by the very thing he thought he could control, the narrative. He built a story he thought was foolproof. But he was the fool, and the proof was everywhere he looked. For Tim Smith, we are left with the memory of the man he was, not the victim he was made to appear. His story, though cut short, is remembered for its authenticity. And for us, the audience to this real-life tragedy, we are left with a sobering reminder. Be careful of the stories you believe, and be even more careful of the stories you tell. Because the plot you're twisting might just be your own. If you've listened this far, thank you. Stories like this are heavy. They sit with you. They make you look at the people around you and wonder about the stories they're telling and the stories they're living. That's the power and the burden of being a reader of the world. We started by saying every murderer tells a story. But the truth is, we all do. Every day, with every text we send, every excuse we make, every version of an event we share. Most of us are just writing small, harmless fictions to get through the day. I'm 5 minutes away. This is my first drink. I never got the email. But the case of Tim Smith and Herb Swilly shows us where that human impulse can lead when poisoned by desperation and malice. It shows us the dangerous, arrogant belief that a story can be more powerful than facts. That a lie, if constructed with enough attention to set dressing, can overwrite the truth. It can't. Reality always has the final edit. It's in the metadata. It's in the physics. It's in the emotional logic that echoes in the hearts of those who truly knew the victim. A stage scene will always feel staged. A rehearsed performance will always have the faint, plastic sheen of performance. A heart that is not broken cannot convincingly mimic the fractures. So what do we do with that? Do we become suspicious of everyone? Do we audit the stories of our loved ones? Perhaps not. But perhaps we become better readers. We learn to trust not just the words spoken, but the harmony or dissonance between those words and everything else we know. We pay attention to the details that don't fit the presented narrative, not with accusation, but with curiosity. Because sometimes, those details are cries for help. And sometimes, they are the first, faint cracks in a terrible facade. Tim Smith's story is over. Herb Swilly's story is confined to a single, concrete plotline for the rest of his days. But our stories continue, and we have a choice in every chapter. Will we write from a place of integrity, even when it's hard? Or will we try to force a narrative onto the world, hoping it will bend to our will? The world doesn't bend. It testifies. It keeps records. It remembers the scent of bleach in a clean apartment. It remembers a walking shadow on a dark road. It remembers the silence where a Ring doorbell's footage used to be. Be an author of your life, yes. But be a humble one. Respect the facts. Respect the truths of other people's stories. And never, ever make the fatal mistake of believing your own fiction is more real than their reality. This has been a look at a story that failed. A story that was fiction, trying to pass for fact. Thank you for listening. Remember to look for the truth behind the tale. And so we close the file. We place the reports back in their folders. We let the security footage freeze on its final, empty frame. The courtroom falls silent. The cell door locks. The machinery of justice has done its work, grinding a complex, painful human tragedy into a simple, binary result. Guilty, not guilty. Life, death. But we are left here, on the outside, with the echoes. With the uncomfortable, lingering questions that true stories leave behind, unlike the neat endings of fiction. The biggest question this story forces us to ask isn't whodunit. We know that. The question is, at what point did the story in Herb's head become more real to him than the man in his bed? When did Tim stop being Tim, a person with hopes, a job interview scheduled, a favorite beach theme, and become an obstacle, a character to be written out? A problem to be solved with the same cold, technical precision he'd used to fix a leaky pipe or frame a wall. That is the true horror, not the violence itself, but the psychological pathway that led to it. The mental alchemy that transforms a person you've loved for 15 years into a mere component in a narrative of grievance, entitlement, and financial survival. Herb didn't just kill his husband. He first, in his mind, erased him and replaced him with a caricature. The ungrateful partner, the wallet about to close, the obstacle to his desired future. The apartment wasn't the only thing he staged. He staged this new version of Tim in his own mind. And once that story was solid enough, the physical staging, the brutal editing of reality, must have felt like a logical, necessary next step. Just finishing the job. This is the caution we take with us. It's not about fearing that our partners might be secret killers. It's about recognizing the corrosive power of the stories we tell ourselves about other people. The narratives of resentment we nurture. The ledgers of what I'm owed we keep in the dark corners of our minds. Herb's story is that poison taken to its absolute, monstrous extreme. For Tim, and for all victims like him, the ultimate injustice is this reduction. To be made a pawn in someone else's bitter, self-pitying story. Our job, as the living, is to refuse that reduction. To remember them in their full, messy, glorious humanity. To talk about Tim's work in Alzheimer's research. His dedication as a sponsor in AA. His love for his sister. The mermaids on his shelves. These are the footnotes that defy the killer's narrative. They shout, asterisk I was here. I was complex. I was loved. Your story about me is a lie. Asterisk. We end, then, not with the killer's failed plot, but with the victim's enduring truth. A life is not a premise. It is not a plot point. It is a universe of details, choices made, kindnesses offered, seashells collected, promises kept. You cannot stage that. You cannot clean it with bleach. You cannot delete it from a doorbell camera. And no story, no matter how cleverly conceived, can ever truly erase it. Hold on to the real stories. They are all we have, and they are everything.